I'm excited to do this. I've been wanting to have you on for a while, and I know you're a busy guy, and I'm glad we were able to kind of, have it on your platform as well. So this is going to be awesome. So I talked to you, I think 2 weeks ago, maybe 2.5 weeks ago, and was asking kind of what you've been interested in what you've been reading. And you were raving about this series and this documentary series. You said it's the best documentary series ever. And, I've known you for a long time, took your word for it. And I've binge watched the whole 13 episodes in the last 2 weeks.
Wow.
And you told me not to. You said it's going to be too much and your head's going to explode. But I did it anyways. I ate from the tree of knowledge. So I've actually kind of been on vacation here. I'm visiting my family, so I had some time, and I've been visiting with them as well. But watching the documentary series as well. And you're right, it's incredible. It was not on my radar before. So this is Jacob Bronowski, 1973, I believe, BBC series. And today we're going to focus on the final episode, which is called The Long Childhood. And this is where he summarizes a lot of his ideas. I mean, the entire series, he looks at the, it's called The Ascent of Man. So he's really trying to ask the question, why man? Why humans? And, in that you get what distinguishes humans from the other animals. And then he, specifically looks at science and, the some of the major breakthroughs in science. But maybe we can just start with this question. So he spends a lot of time talking about man as distinguished from other animals. And the way he phrases it, as only he could, he says, what makes man what he is? And, the premise here is that there is something special. There's something unique about man from all the other animals. He gives some of the examples. I think in this episode, he says, it's the human creature who rides the horse and not the other way around. There must be something unique about man, evidently, because otherwise the ducks would be lecturing about Lorenz and the rats would be writing papers about B.F. Skinner. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of his funny way of saying it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's kind of our starting point. And one more thing before we get into it, this is a pretty core question, that a lot of thinkers have spent a lot of time on. And he attacks this from many different ways. And in the first episode, he says the physical differences are secondary. So when we're trying to, and we'll get into it later, that it's mostly that, our brain is unique. And, but I was thinking maybe to start off, we can start with some of these physical differences between humans and other animals, because I think they're definitely worth kind of hitting on. Does that
Wonderful. Okay? So Zach, I'm very excited about, being part of your podcast. And this is like the perfect topic because it is so rich. And I'm delighted that you ended up binge watching all the 13 episodes. If you have to do binge watching on something, this is a good thing to binge watch.
Yes.
All right. So what sets man apart? I think the best way to look at it is through the evolutionary cycle. Okay, firstly, I want to say that my ability to deal with Bronowski's material is not very good. Okay, because this is very, very deep stuff. And I think I have some ability, but not good. Okay, so I'm going to try my best. Okay, but there is so much. There is so much here, and so it's so deep.
Absolutely.
So I think the way in which I would start is to look at the transition of man from being on all fours to standing upright. Because what standing upright does in one stroke, it increases the visual field. Instead of being at this low level in the middle of grass where you can hardly see anything, you're now way up there and you can see things at a distance. Okay. Secondly, it frees up your hands.
Yeah.
So you're able to do things with it. And we have these opposable thumbs, which allows for precision. Combination of the visual impact. I mean, the first result of that is that brain starts to grow. Because so much data, so much more data is coming in, and we are able to do so much with it.
Yeah.
That loop, the control mechanism for that loop, which is the brain, starts to grow in order to make the most of it. So that's a giant step forward. Hand, he talks about hand. My friend Zoya, calls, I think one of the episodes, I think it's episode 2, the ode to the hand. Because what the hand does, I mean, and the way in which he puts the hand is that there is this loop between the hand and the brain. That hand is the cutting edge of the brain. He sees human beings as a living being, and he's seeing all of cogitation as a way of living, of transforming the world. So that loop is something that he focuses on. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Well, and our hands are the primary way that we manipulate the world. And Bronowski makes the point that we're not the only species with opposable thumbs, but we are the only species that can link the thumb to the forefinger. And this is a very powerful, very powerful combination. It allows us to use and manipulate tools in certain ways. And, something I think about is like, you can imagine a creature with the intellect of a human that doesn't have any hands, and they're very limited. Even something like a dolphin. I mean, obviously a dolphin is intelligent. I'm not saying a dolphin is as intelligent as a human, but they have flippers. They're very limited. So I think that's a really big point. And he says one of the ways that maybe this has been symbolically represented throughout time has been in the symbol of the Buddha. And there's a kind of the Buddha, I know people listening to this can't see, but he's kind of holding up like a Diana Ross "Stop in the Name of Love," to use an example.
That's a great image. Buddha and Diana Ross.
Yeah. But Bronowski says the Buddha is giving the hand, which is the gift of humanity. Which I thought was really cool. A really cool, kind of symbolic metaphor for the importance of the hand.
So I think upright posture, then hand. And then the big thing that he focuses on is foresight. That the animal is focused on the immediate surrounding, the here and now. And the thing that characterizes human beings is to operate at a distance and operate at a different time. So you can see it initially just by hunting, looking at the context of hunting, where you're able to see both kind of the predator coming at a distance so you can respond to it, plan for it, or you can see a prey at a distance and you can go ahead and coordinate from that. But mostly it is about time, of being able to think about in the future of what would happen and consider the possibilities. So that ability of, imagination of possibilities and foresight of looking across time is.
I really like that. I hadn't made that connection, but I like, because you're kind of saying it's our physical ability to see further and to see above, the horizon. And there's a link there between, the parts of our brain that start to develop, which allow us to, plan into the future, and that those things are correlated.
Exactly. And that it's the starting point. It's the starting point. And then man takes those faculties that were developed in that context and uses his imagination to use them in a way which is completely on a different orders of magnitude than was possible in the physical context.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe the third one, since we're kind of talking about some of the the benefits of humans starting to walk upright, Another one, it wasn't in here, but it made me think of it. I know Jared Diamond talks about when we started walking upright, it allowed the vocal cords to expand. And, that's another thing. We're just talking about physical differences between humans. Obviously, other animals can make sounds, but our ability to make a wide range of sounds and to manipulate sound, is one of the reasons that we're able to communicate at such a high level. So I think vocal cords is another pretty damn good benefit to walking upright.
Absolutely. And what vocal cords make possible? Speech, and then using speech to coordinate actions socially. So there is coordination amongst primates. Chimpanzees can hunt, and they can hunt pretty well. But what speech does is that it increases both kind of precision and complexity of what can be communicated.
Yeah.
So addition of speech as a social tool makes possible transmission of whatever discovery individuals make and making them standard issue of everybody in the group. And thus you build on that. So I think speech is huge.
Yeah, it's huge. And we'll kind of probably get into some of the other benefits, speech and language are just part of our ability to communicate ideas and knowledge that has been gained through generation to generation and pass it down to the children.
I want to hit one last point before we move on. And that's tools.
Tools.
Tool making, because tool making is like extension of the hand. I always think of it as extension of the hand. So you're using your hand to create something outside of yourself that you're going to now use. You're going to develop procedures for using it. And that is again passed as part of the culture to leverage the ability of the group as a whole, as well as individuals. So tool making, I think it was Benjamin Franklin who called man tool making animals. I think that is profoundly true.
Yeah, I like that as well. And tool making as opposed to tool using, because again, that's another one of the, I think it was Jane Goodall who kind of busted the myth that humans are the only animals to use tools. But, we have like chimpanzees will use like a stick to fish out termites and like a log or something, but they're not really creating tools. They're not really crafting tools, maybe in the way that humans do. Well, cool. So maybe we can move on to talking about the long childhood.
Wonderful.
So this is the core of what this episode is about. All right. He says humans are neotenous. And this was a new word for me. He says neotenous means we come from the womb still as embryos. And this is a huge idea. I mean, he makes the idea that, a lot of other species of animals, when they come out of the womb, they're more or less developed. They're more or less where they're going to be. I mean, a snake from day one is self-sufficient. Their mother, I don't even think he even sees them. They're just like on their own, ready to go. Other animals, maybe take a couple of months of parental investment. Some other animals, a couple of years. And then you look at humans. And, humans, probably the first 13, 14 years of life, they need adults to not die. And, some people would even say nowadays, maybe somebody needs an adult until they're in their 50s or something. But so the question is why? This is obviously a huge kind of parental investment. It's a liability. And so yeah, maybe we can use that as our jumping off point.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. It's a major investment, and there has to be a reason why
right
that is worth it. And essentially what happens is that human beings are born with only half their brain formed, and rest of the half of the brain development takes place outside while interacting with other human beings and the surroundings. So that plasticity of adaptability gets built in. So for example, as you were pointing out, snake, when it is born, it is carbon copy of its parents. It's able to do everything that the parent does.
Yeah.
And that's fantastic because it is ready to go right off the bat.
Yeah.
But that means, and it means that if the environment is the same, that snake's ability is going to be fantastic. It's a very effective way. But if the environment is different, then it's not going to be able to adapt to that. So it's hard-coded. Whereas the child learns from the parents, the culture. So while the brain is forming, so it adds a level of plasticity to human beings on a tremendous scale. And it's a scale. So this is essentially the mammalian path, where the childhood of a more advanced mammal is longer in proportion to their lifespan.
Yeah. Well, and just you mentioned plasticity. I mean, that's the huge, I think that's the big point that he brings up throughout this whole episode is, it's our ability to adapt to the environment, adapt to the culture, and to even change the culture to fit our needs. He makes a point, I don't know if it's in this episode or another one, that basically like other animals adapt to fit their environment. Humans change our environment to fit us. So it's also, I think our ability to adapt also allows us to do that.
That's a great point. And we should have made that point, when you say, what is it that is unique about human beings? If you want to really summarize what is unique about human beings, is that we transform our environment.
Yeah.
We, instead of adapting to the environment, we are able to transform the environment. And that's really the hallmark of human beings.
Yeah. And maybe one more point, while we're kind of talking about the plasticity, he, at one point in the documentary, he pulls a skull from I can never pronounce, Australopithecus. I think I'm butchering that, but he pulls up the skull, from one of our ancient ancestors, and he says, what makes their brain different from ours? And he says, if we think about the brain as a computer, it's not just that our brains are a more advanced computer than their brain. Like he's like, yes, it is, it is a more kind of advanced computer, but it's a different kind of machine. And maybe a computer is not a good analogy. He says, quote, if the brain were a computer, then it would be carrying out a pre-wired set of actions in an inflexible sequence. And then he says, if we are any kind of machine, then we are a learning machine. So yeah, I think that's a big point. Cool. And cool. So we talked a little bit about plasticity.
I want to hit one more
point please.
About the long childhood.
Yeah.
Children are characterized by curiosity, of openness to the world, of interest in the world, of fascination with the world. And what he's pointing out is that capacity in human beings is the heart of who we are. Asking questions and relentlessly asking questions, open-ended questions. I mean, it's very different from the snake example that we're talking about, where it's all about, there is no curiosity there at all. There is just, curiosity being kind of the hallmark of children, and curiosity being hallmark of man as such.
Yeah. And it's also maybe the hallmark of science. because
Yes.
science, and he kind of alludes to this point that science and children are similar,
Mm-hmm.
and that a child is constantly asking why. A child is constantly questioning. And, um, he also makes the point. Let's see if I can pull up the exact quote. He says, "Our scientific civilization adores above all else the symbol of the child." And he gives some examples of, he says, ever since the Renaissance, I should add. And he gives the example of the Christ child painted by Raphael and the children Gauss and Dickens portray. So, in our kind of 21st century scientific civilization, I guess he sees the emphasis that our civilization, he sees our civilization valuing the child, and maybe even above the adult, which I think it's an interesting point. It has a lot of implications, maybe why we value youth so much in our culture and day and age, where maybe some traditional cultures, and we'll get into a little bit, he talks about static cultures. We'll get into that in a little later. But a lot of these more traditional cultures, there's a lot more kind of respect and reverence for the elders and the tradition that we maybe lack. At least, I don't know. I think that's a safe thing to say that. So I don't know. I guess I had never made that connection in that, it is the same curiosity and questioning and reverence for the child that maybe distinguishes our culture from others.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And he makes that point when he starts to compare. Look at these traditional cultures.
Yeah.
With Easter Island.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good transition to get into talking about static cultures. So he says, though our culture values the child, he says that's not the only way that cultures tend to be. He says we have examples of what he calls static cultures. So let's see. He says, for most of history, children have been asked simply to conform to the image of the adult. And he sees static cultures as being, like he says, a lot of times nomadic cultures are static cultures. And I think he says it's because they basically don't have time for innovation. They're always on the run. They're always on the move. And what is most effective is for the children to emulate the adults. And, he says, like, in these cultures, you even look at the little kids and they're basically just trying to emulate their parents and become them. And the culture kind of praises that. And so that was kind of the point I was making before. Maybe that's why in those cultures there's such kind of reverence and respect for the elders.
It is interesting. He starts by showing us the statues of Easter Island, these expressionless faces. And the child, this alive face, is trying to emulate, to become that. So it's actually it's a reversal of mammalian sequence of, instead of being kind of having longer and longer childhood, you're holding up for the child the ideal of being like a little snake. No, you're not a mammal, please be a snake. Be exact carbon copy of your parents. So this entire mammalian, it's like erasing that part of evolution and going back to a much more primitive way of operation.
Yeah. Well, and he says when you look at some of these, a lot of these thinkers who draw up these utopias, you get people like Plato and his Republic and Sir Thomas More, like the utopias that they imagine are always static cultures. They kind of imagine, okay, if I create this, amazing society, that it can just stay static and be the same, and it will always work for humans. And I think what Bronowski's saying is that's like a deadly flaw to make. It's because you're not taking into account the what man is, and man is plastic, as you said earlier, and there's always going to be an element of change. So I think what he's saying is anytime we get these kind of dogmatic ideas about this is the way it will be for all time, it's bound to fail. And he brought up Easter Island. He says we look at these statues now and they look crude and archaic to our eyes, and we kind of look back like, how could they have thought that this would be the ideal that humans should live up to until the end of time? Because if we know one thing about humans, is that they're always changing.
Right. I mean, this idea of static, I want to bring the parallels between three things. So all these utopias, which people think are like the height of intellectualism, whether it is Plato, whether it is Thomas More, there's a whole bunch of other ones, including the concept of heaven, for example, which is kind of static. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That is similar to traditional cultures, like a nomad. And that is similar to a snake, or to basically to a very primitive way of being. And that is being held as an ideal in very sophisticated, snakes is actual biology. The kind of nomadic cultures is that in a human, but fairly, in the oral culture. And then you have things like Plato in a written culture, using all these words, but trying to do the same thing, trying to go back to that. And the contrast to that is the active process of concept of growth, concept of continuously facing challenges and overcoming the challenges and going to the next level and facing more challenges as a result of that, which is a very different mindset. So I see it as being static versus dynamic, static, like almost like a stone, versus this living system, which is dynamic with a feedback, continuous feedback, where no matter what you come up with in your head or with your hands, you do not regard them as the final, but only as a stepping stone to go to the next level.
Yeah, no, I love that. Well, and he gives plenty of examples of static cultures. And I should mention, he doesn't just say that these nomadic cultures tend to be static. He also gives the example of like Egypt and Assyria and China and Europe in the Middle Ages. So he says, even like Western civilization, there have been instances where at some point the culture kind of became static. And I think what he's implying there is that's why these, that's why they've failed. And, that's why we've had, the end of these cultures. And one other thing I was thinking, maybe the more dynamic culture, the culture who is open to changing and adapting, I don't know, would you say something like the Constitution and the amendments are something that's more in alignment with that, where it's, at least in theory, it's basically saying we know that things are going to continue to change, and so we need to build into the system something that allows for that to happen?
Absolutely. Zach, this is a fantastic point. And I don't think I get it well.
Okay.
Because it's a very deep point. Because on one hand, it is really a point of epistemology. This is the heart of science, where you're focused on asking questions. scientist wants to ask questions. Once they have figured something out, they will start asking new questions. So there is always this, it's the epistemology of saying that I'm not going to just hold on to the answers, that I'm going to keep asking questions. So that's one part of it, that there is a sense of growth to it. So first, let's look at it just at the epistemological level. Yeah. Okay. And then let's look at it at kind of political, economic level. Okay. Again, my knowledge is very, very poor here. Okay. So I'm just ad-libbing here. Okay. So what happens? So one part of science. Okay. The second part of it is the objectiveness of it, that a scientist will write things down. This is what I think. This is why I think it. And other people can look at it and critique it. And that is considered good. And if the scientists found that they were wrong, they will say, thank you. Thank you for correcting it. So this is what Royal Society is about. And this is like the Enlightenment culture. Okay. In terms of the technology, it's the print technology which makes it at a completely different level of scale. So people can independently look at things and then talk to each other, make arguments, learn from each other, and that is considered good. Contrast that to Egypt, where all the knowledge is hierarchical. Yeah. There is a priest king at the top who controls both kind of the spiritual dimension and the physical dimension. Right. So there is an element of freedom of thought that is there. So at the epistemological level, it's something very different. And you can see it happening in Enlightenment. You can see the harbingers of it in Renaissance, of people doing it at an artistic level. And then you see the fullest explication of it in conceptual, explicit terms in Enlightenment. Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're making these transitions super easy for me, because that really transitions into, next thing we're going to talk about was democracy of the intellect. And, you made the point, in some of these traditional cultures, or, even in places like Egypt or, in the Middle Ages, where only a handful of people had access to the information, and there was a certain kind of hierarchy. And he calls this a minority culture. He says a minority culture is where only a tiny fraction of all the talent that mankind produces is actually used, learns to read, learns to write, learns another language. And one of the things he points to that changed this, at least in Europe, was the printing press. And this, of course, allowed access to, a lot more people. And there were no longer these kind of gatekeepers of knowledge and information. Whereas, before, maybe you had to be a monk if you wanted to have access to the books or have access to the library. Now we have the printing press, which makes all this information a lot more available, leading to, the democracy of the intellect. And, and we could, this documentary was made before the internet, but we could, carry that forward and say the internet just, it took that to the next level as far as making information available. Absolutely. And I want to pick up on what you started this segment with about the Constitution. So let's look at it at a political level. What is different in the conception of individuals in the Declaration of Independence as compared to Egypt? Egypt says that it's the top-down structure, and individual is a little cog in this entire machine. Whereas Jefferson starts by saying that the prime movers are these individuals, and what is sacred is their own pursuit of their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And in order to protect that, you create governments. So the direction is exactly opposite.
Yeah.
So it is the freedom of action, freedom of exploration, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to shape your own life and pursue your own happiness. That at an individual level. And so it's at all these different particles, all these many particles. That's what the goal is. Okay, so let's just look at the goal. That is dramatically different from that Easter Island. We're saying goal is to become that.
Yeah.
Of a limited thing. And that's, if you aspire and if you do very well, you will become that. And that is the ceiling. Whereas these are like children trying to grow.
Right.
So it is at the kind of a metaphysical level, it's a different conception of man and society.
No, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, is there anything else you wanted to touch on in as far as democracy? Then it's like, oh, please.
Yeah. I want to connect the point about the democracy. So just like in science, okay, and this is actually far more, you can far easily see this in the Constitution. So, okay, you have these individual people, right? Lots of individual people. So how do you build a structure that allows people to actually flourish? And the idea of founding fathers is that you have this system of checks and balances where there are many, many parts that balance each other, and you have to negotiate, you have to make compromises for things to happen. It is like, there is an amazing book that I've just come across. It's called Constitution of Knowledge. I forget the name of the author. If somebody can put it in the chat, that'll be great. What he says is that the way in which founding fathers structured the Constitution and the way in which the democracy of intellect works, or kind of the scientific community or Royal Society works, is similar, where everybody can say their piece or is free to say their piece. There is a freedom of expression, and there are these systems that are built in order to evaluate things, and things that pass certain evaluations, certain kind of commonality, go to the next level and become more influential. So there is a negotiation going on. Instead of ideas going top down, they kind of bubble up, bottom up.
Kind of, would like a meritocracy be the right word, or?
Yes, but it's dynamic in the sense that it is negotiated all the time. And there are areas where somebody is going to be better, where they flourish more, they do things more, they control things more. And if they start failing, there are other forces. So it's a dynamic system of checks and balances, which keep correcting things, just like it does in scientific papers, like scientific community. The same thing happening at a political level.
Yeah, no, and I love that whole the connection of kind of science, the way that science works, kind of mapping that onto how a government should essentially work. I think that's a really big idea, and that a good scientist is always willing to want to hear when they're wrong. They're one, like you said, it's peer reviewed. They're constantly being critiqued and, having their experiments replicated and having that feedback happening. So yeah. And I think that's maybe, one of the points he's making about government, and that when that doesn't happen, that's when culture tends to stagnate and turn into dogma, turn into, and he talks about in the, I think 2 episodes before this, a lot of what happened in World War II and the concentration camps. I think he made some point there that like he's at the very end, he's like in Auschwitz, and he's saying this is what happens when we claim to have absolute knowledge and absolute certainty. So yeah, I mean, he makes the point pretty profoundly there.
Excellent.
Cool. You cool to move on to talking about social solitary?
Yes.
All right, beautiful. So this is actually a point that he makes at the very beginning of this episode or essay. He actually refers to these as essays, which I loved. So at the beginning of this essay, he says justice is a universal of all cultures. He says justice is part of the biological equipment of man. And then he says justice is a tightrope man walks between his desire to fulfill his wishes and his acknowledgement of social responsibility. So, and then he says an animal is either social or solitary. Man is alone in being a social solitary. In that we have a responsibility and a commitment to the group and a need for, we're social animals, and, we do not do well completely isolated. But at the same time, we have these individual desires. We have, these individual drives to make ourselves great. And he tends to have a bit of like a kind of great man theory in that like history and innovations have come about by, individuals, trying to better themselves and perfect their craft. So that's kind of the collide. And again, this quote, justice is a tightrope man walks between his desire to fulfill his wishes and his acknowledgement of social responsibilities. And this also kind of made me think, I recently read Civilization and Its Discontents, and that's a kind of big point that Freud has as well, that we have these individual desires, but then we also have to coexist and, live in a community. And, at least Freud would say this is what causes a lot of our neurosis. I want to kill my neighbor. I want to have sex with that person, but it's not socially, it doesn't conform to the, my social responsibility. But anyways, so I know that's a lot there, but what were your thoughts about social solitary?
Yeah, the way in which I understand it is that his point is that we are social solitary. So we are social in a very deep way, and we are solitary in a very deep way. And both those are core parts of who we are. We are social in the sense that if you look at your life, how much do you owe to other people? People's work, people in the past, people in the present. It is humongous. When we're talking in language. Language is all, social creation over a period of time. So you take in everything that the society has produced. And our life depends on it. Yet, all new things are created by an individual having a vision, imagining something, having the courage and the confidence to work it all out and to create something. So all new things that are being motivated by an individual, are created by an individual. So in that sense, all these social goods that we're talking about are the result of individual creation. And moment a society which doesn't respect that is going to become stagnant and start to die. So at the same time, an individual by themselves, if they were trying to cut themselves off from the society, their ability to produce goes down dramatically.
Right.
So it is social and it is individual. And for example, again, going back to the founding fathers, e pluribus unum, the one in many. That is the idea. The individuals are the many. Society is the one. And you have to structure things so that the many can flourish in a way, and the one has the stability that provides stability for all these individual actions from many to produce, not hurt each other, and provide means of bouncing off one another in order to produce much more value than what individuals themselves can produce. So I think one in many captures the heart of this point of social solitary.
That was great. That was great. And I liked what you were saying, because you were kind of talking a little bit about language. And, if give an example of a human born on a desert island, they're not taught anything, they're not around anybody. They're basically having to figure out everything from scratch. You and I, we have the ability to read, the ability to communicate, and, this gift of language, which allows us to gather all of the insights from our ancestors for the last couple thousands of years. And we're able to then, stand on the shoulders of giants, which I think that's a really big point. And you were talking about earlier, again, another, kind of difference between humans and, other animals is our ability to do that. And that, the snake is starting from ground zero each generation. Whereas humans, with our ability to communicate, with our gift of language, we're able to pass on all of that knowledge and wisdom. And that's, I think that's what he calls progress.
Absolutely. I mean, people like, Merlin Donald do a very good job of talking about this point. They talk about, they call it, he calls it external memory.
Okay.
So whether it is writing or whether it is furniture or whether it is cities that you build, is external memory. It is, and what external memory, it is a product of individual consciousness working to shape something, but is accessible and manipulatable and useful to others. So it's the middle term through which consciousnesses can interact with one another, whether through a book or a road.
So is external, just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, is this similar to like, I don't have to understand how to, I don't know, code or something like that, as long as I know that these other people in my society.
No, it is far more down to earth concept. When you look at a paper, when you're writing on the paper, okay, when you're writing with your pen, that is external memory. So what was there in your head is now on paper.
Okay.
And what that does, and the biggest innovation, I think the biggest invention which moved everything forward is writing. Because what it does is it externalizes thought.
Yeah.
You are able to organize it externally, and other people are able to see it. And it's scaling of it both internally with a feedback loop with your own consciousness, added with the feedback loop with other consciousnesses, which are not necessarily present right there, scales things up dramatically.
Well, yeah. And it's, I think he says something, I was trying to find the exact quote, but it's something like, we're able to pull things and ideas apart and then put them back together again, which I know, to get a little meta, which kind of what we did to prepare for this discussion was we both you and I watched the episode a few times and then kind of hashed out all the ideas, and then we kind of put them all on a big piece of paper and then kind of say, okay, well, this belongs over here, this belongs over here. And, that's that kind of, sounds to me, that's that kind of external.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So it's the map. I don't know whether you have it or not, but if you have the paper, you can
I think I do. Yeah.
The paper. So that's okay. That is this conversation, how we put it all together. And what we did was that it's kind of initially getting individual kind of key concepts on paper first, and seeing the connections between them. And both of us doing it together. So we can say, oh, this needs to be added to it, or this organization, this needs to be grouped together. And then figuring out what is the proper order of it, all of it being done on paper. Firstly, for just if I was doing it myself, I would need to do that. But doing this together with you enables, both our thought processes, both our context to be brought to bear on the same thing.
Well, and I think also what I find interesting about it is for, I think, Bronowski, or at least the person editing the documentary, the order in which they presented the information made the most sense, or that kind of grouping of it. But for me, when I watched it the first time, I was like, man, he's all over the place. Like, what the heck's going on? And I kind of needed to, like I said, take out all the ideas and then kind of reorganize them in a structure that made sense to me. And, I know you did the same thing. And part of what our back and forth was finding kind of a way to talk about the material that would, make sense to both of us.
Yes, exactly. It's kind of like doing a map, a map of the territory in an abstracted way, and then kind of comparing the maps and bringing them together as a way of navigating through the territory.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, cool. Maybe we can move on to the final part of the map.
Yes.
So he talks about a little bit about an ideal for the individual, or kind of what each of us as an individual should be striving for. And you kind of hinted on it earlier. Part of what he sees us having a moral responsibility towards is seeking knowledge and the kind of questioning. And, I think he harps on that a lot throughout this series, is that, the moment we stop questioning, and just kind of revert back to dogma or old ideas, that's when the culture will become stagnant, and that's when, basically the culture will end. So I think that's one of the big ideas. And the other one is, he tells a story at the very end about while shooting this episode, a cameraman went up in a plane to film, and the plane actually crashed. And he was having a conversation with the person who was going to, be the next cameraman and get on the next plane to go up. And he's kind of saying, like, are you nervous, or are you considering not doing it? And this guy said, I am scared, but it's my job and I have to do it anyways. So I think he makes a point there too, that we all have kind of a personal responsibility, or, moral obligation to our craft, and to kind of perfecting our craft as an individual. And that's, I think, what he sees leading to progress, kind of like we talked about earlier. It's individuals, trying to get a little bit better at the thing that they're doing, that, moves society forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I like his phrase, personal commitment to one's own skill is the cause of Ascent of Man. So individuals saying, that I'm committed to my own skill. Another way in which he expresses it is in terms of taking responsibility for your own integrity. He's talking, this theme appears again and again. It's basically your own kind of judgment of saying this is what is right, this is what is good, and taking full responsibility for it and forging a path. Typically, whether it is a scientist or an artist, they are out there on the limb on their own, and they have to have that confidence in their own skill, in their own being, in their own integrity, even when people around them don't seem to get it or are actively hostile to it. And that is what moves us forward.
Yeah, and it's a complicated thing. I thought about a few podcasts ago. Somehow we got into talking about AI and artificial intelligence and the people working on AI, and we were talking about how even if somehow we were to know that creating AI would be a fatal thing to do, and I still don't think there would be any stopping it, because as we've talked about earlier, like the nature of humans is change, and the nature is to constantly better themselves. So I think some of it is maybe we have such a commitment to perfecting our craft that I don't want to say it doesn't matter what the goal is, but maybe the goal itself is getting better, as opposed to the goal is to create this thing to help humanity or and whatnot. I don't know.
He has a different view in that last episode. What he's saying is that if you're a scientist, if you're an engineer, you should try to take responsibility for everything. You should try to understand the consequences of what you're doing. You're trying to, because if you're one step ahead of everybody else in being able to understand something and doing, and being able to do something technologically, then you should take the responsibility of saying, is this a good thing? What does it do to human beings? Under what conditions we can protect and thrive at the same time? So that is what he's talking about, of kind of taking responsibility.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it was a little bit, I had it kind of conceptualized a little bit differently. Well, that was kind of the end of my notes. Were there any kind of things that we maybe missed or jumped over?
I think we did a good job of taking notes. So we had a map and we've gone through the map.
Awesome. Well, cool. If you're happy, I'm happy.
Yes, I'm very happy.
Beautiful. Well, let's call it there. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. We've kind of been chatting about these ideas for the last week or so. We were, at a mutual friend's wedding and trying to be respectful, not to be talking about Brzezinski when the bride was coming down the aisle. But we finally got a chance to let loose and explore some of these ideas. So
wonderful. Thank you, Zach. This is a great delight. I always like speaking to you. So this is a great chance to speak to you about something that I'm really, really interested in.
Thanks for listening to Unpacking Ideas. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend, or scroll down and write a review or give us a rating. I know that takes a little bit of effort, but it really helps the podcast grow. So thanks so much for doing that in advance. If you would like to read along with us, please visit unpackingideas.com/podcast, where I post links to the articles and essays that we'll be discussing on future podcast episodes. And finally, if you would like to hear more from Shrikant or get in touch with him, check out his Meetup at, it is called 52 Living Ideas. And he hosts meetups that are available online via Zoom. all around the world, but in particular in the New York City area. So if you're in the New York area, just type in 52 Living Ideas, you will see him. And you can also check out his videos on YouTube at 52 Living Ideas. All right, guys, that'll do it for this episode. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.